justice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
All right. So I guess we can roll right into the first topic. We're very excited at Midwestern Marks, all of us. I mean, I can't imagine how you feel, Carlos, given the amount of time and effort you've put into this book, but we're all really excited that Carlos's new book dropped. Yeah, I'll let you take it away, Carlos, if you want to sort of pitch your book, talk about why you wrote it and, the core thesis or core message, whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, this is a concept that I I developed as a sort of individual, basically, I think 2 years ago now, but it's been really fundamental for all of us at the institute. And you, me, Noah, Tom, we've all had countless conversations in which the concept has been really elucidating for our approach to understanding reality, to understanding some of the flaws we see in the left. And so I figured that with the encouragement of the editorial board, it was time to get all of these ideas that had been concretizing around our usage of the concept for basically 2 years to put them all together in one place in a way that captures historically the roots of what I'm calling the purity fetish outlook, but that also captures the unique forms it presents itself in the 20th century and Western Marxist authors, folks like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and others, how it appears in the 21st century in prominent Marxist scholars like Wojciech, and then specifically how it appears in U.S. socialist movements. And I developed like the various forms it appears in the U.S. And I think really the importance of this concept is that it allows us to think in a comprehensive manner about the specific mistakes that various people have been criticizing in the Marxist-Leninist left about the more general left in the West for quite some time, but without the framework that ties it to the ideological outlook, to the ideological grounds, which are the precondition for these mistakes, right? So, for instance, in the US, I talk about the rejection of actually existing socialism, the rejection of big parts of the working class, the rejection of its national past and using it in the process of struggling for a socialist future. I describe all of those as different forms through which this purity fetish outlook concretizes itself in socialist practice. And, in every instance, what I find is that not only does it prevent people from attaining truth, that is, from attaining a proper, concrete, dialectical understanding of the world, but also it prevents them from building a revolutionary movement. And it's no coincidence that, here in the West, we really haven't been able to build anything of substance in terms of socialism. I mean, we had the GDR for quite some years, but it wasn't like it was achieved through a popular revolution. We had the Portuguese Revolution, which is somewhat of a special condition because it was led by the military and it was sort of led by an anti-colonial sentiment that developed in the generals and in the military. But in essence, that the West hasn't produced any mass revolutionary movement that has triumphed as the third world and the East and the global South in general has been able to. And so I find that this purity fetish, again, it not only makes the Western left and Western Marxism in specific unable to understand the world, unable to capture truth and understand the world dialectically, but also unable to build a revolutionary movement. It divorces them from their masses. It divorces them from this global communist movement and the struggle for socialism globally. And consistently, it aligns them with imperialism. So again, a lot of the things that I am saying when it comes to individual critique, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. There's been amazing critics from our tradition, people like Michael Parenti, citing all the time in my book, and Gabriel Rockhill and Domenico Losurdo and Roland Bohr and all these great Marxist-Leninist theorists who have participated in criticizing some of these flaws. But what has never developed out of that is really this comprehensive concept that ties it all together and that ties it all to the ideological grounds and that also explains how that ideological ground is rooted in this very long tradition of how Western philosophy understands the question of truth, how it understands the question of universals, um, and also in certain material conditions which proliferate this sort of compatible left, as the CIA agent Thomas Braden called it, which proliferates what Gabriel Rockhill calls radical recuperators. And that it's a class position primarily within the professional managerial class, or what in old Marxist Leninist terms we would call the petty bourgeoisie, which isn't necessarily just small shopkeepers, but it relates to a whole way of doing politics that it aligns itself consistently with the bourgeoisie while having the sort of veneer of radicalism on top of it. So I bring it all together, and then I think one of the longest chapters might be the China chapter, where I think that there's a heightened importance to the purity fetish in the case of China, because we have generals telling us that we might be at war within the next 2 years with China. And that's extremely scary, as the situation that we have right now with the proxy war against Russia is very scary, because we're literally being tiptoed into a nuclear Armageddon. And, instead of the left and people who consider themselves Marxists uniting, debunking the propaganda, the atrocity propaganda that's said on China and on Russia about Russia, and standing together in solidarity with these countries, specifically in the case of China, showing how it is that socialism has been able to lift 800 million people out of poverty, how the living standards are so much higher than they were 30 years ago, how they're, getting frankly higher than in most cities in America, how their cities are a lot better than ours, how they have new cities popping up left and right, and how socialism is succeeding, and how Marxism has proven its truth in China. Instead of doing this, the Western left just falls for all the BS, atrocity propaganda, all the lies that are manufactured to create consent for war. Or as Parenti would say, the reality that's invented in order to deceive people and into believing a basket full of lies. So I dig into the case of China a whole lot deeper because of its heightened importance, and I critique some of the regular assertions that you hear from Marxists in the West. China took the capitalist road, and during reform and opening up in 1978, markets means no longer socialism, having private ownership, even if it's an auxiliary form of ownership next to a centrally planned state economy. That means it's not socialism. I tackle all of these different critiques, also the one that China's authoritarian, and you know it couldn't be really more absurd when you actually look at the evidence in a comprehensive and dialectical manner. So that's what you can expect from the book. I try to mention in my acknowledgement that really it wouldn't have been possible without the Institute and without the conversations that I've had with you, with Noah, with Tom, with other folks on our e-board, and with the folks that we bring on to do interviews with, which, the vast majority of them, we've been able to build relationships of comradeship and friendship. Folks like Alan Freeman, Radhika Desai, Gabriel Rock, and many others whose relationships I've valued very much, and whose scholarship I respect tremendously. And I think it's the best of the best, the creme de la creme that is being produced today in terms of Marxist scholarship. So grounding myself on them, trying to expand in various areas beyond them with the concept of the purity fetish, with the concept of controlled counter-hegemony. And yeah, the book is doing very well so far. The reception has been kind of beyond what I was expecting. Noah had very high hopes for the book, and he's been expecting the reaction. I guess came to the publication of it a little bit more humbled. I wasn't expecting, for it to get the reaction that it's gotten, but it's been incredible. So yeah, pick it up at the midwesternmarks.com/books.
Yes, in our store section. Absolutely. It was kind of wild watching the endorsements roll in from, Roland Bohr and Gabriel Rockhill. I'm like, wow, these are these people who we've looked up to and learned from and respected for so long. And they're finding value in this concept. And, it's a concept that, like you said, and I appreciate you giving me any credit in the development of that concept, but it's been useful truly for all of us, in analyzing, for me, focusing a lot of my stuff on geopolitics, understanding why these are a lot of Western so-called socialists have such a hard time supporting existing socialism, or at least supporting their struggle against imperialism and their right to self-determination. And Yeah, and one of the points that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I have yet to read the book, unfortunately. I'm waiting for to get a copy of the paperback. But one of the things I've been thinking about recently is the pedagogical use or the educational use of teaching our own history as a history of class struggle. Because people know, generally the Civil War and some of the major figures, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln. But what people don't know, and this is why a book like The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste is, ended up being so groundbreaking, because it gave an economic analysis of slavery. And he basically says that there weren't that many technological advancements in cotton picking, and all that you were getting advancements in was in the separation of cotton, which just meant they needed more cotton to be picked so it could be separated by the cotton gin. So what they did was just increase the amount of torture, right, to try and increase the intensity of labor. If the intensity of labor isn't high, as high as we want it, we'll inflict some sort of punishment or some sort of pain. And this was groundbreaking because the class dynamics of the struggle that culminated in the Civil War are rarely told. Not only were slave uprisings increasing, and you had like the John Brown led uprising, but there was also a sort of decrepit, beat down working class of white people in the American South who were starting to hate the plantation oligarchy. And, Andrew Jackson was almost like a right wing populist. He said, I'm going to go against the plantation oligarchy. We're still going to be racist and massacre indigenous people, but I'll give the working people a few things against the oligarchs. So I'm just teaching the class dynamics that culminated in that Civil War. And, you had the Northern industrial capitalists who were drawn into a struggle or drawn into competition for colonies and for resources, and, even trying to expand within the United States. The slave owning plantation oligarchs in the South were drawn into a competition with the industrialists in the North. And all these different class dynamics were what drove the war and culminated in the war, which led to a revolution in the mode of production, a transition out of slavery and towards capitalism. So, when you hear that class struggle drives history, or that famous Marx quote about class struggle driving history, it can sound a little bit abstract until you particularize it, until you concretize it. And what a better way to concretize it than with our own history? But you can't do that if you're attached to this purity fetishism. Like, no, don't even talk to me about Abraham Lincoln and his, role within the class struggle. That ultimately was a progressive class struggle and moved the mode of production forward. He had racist ideas, or he wrote things that I disagree with, dismiss him completely. He's terrible. Our whole history is terrible. Our whole revolutionary history is bad and impure. It's a bulwark to knowledge. It's ultimately a form of idealism. And I think it's something that you've identified in your book. And that's why it's such a useful book right now for Western leftists who want to turn our country into not an imperialist, hegemonic, white supremacist, capitalist country.
Right. And in the case of how American communists relate themselves to this history, I think the it's the example that best shows the fact that we're dealing with an outlook, not just with individual mistakes, and that even the people who proclaim themselves to be within the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, within the tradition that has built socialism and the third world, even these people who are supportive of the socialist experiments which have taken root around the world, they fall for this in this area. They fall for this form of national nihilism, as Georgy Dimitrov, calls it, which is because the past of America is impure. I'm going to reject it wholesale. And if I recuperate any of the positive elements, and these people are very obviously of Black Panthers, usually they're fond of different figures that are very much in the progressive tradition and the best parts of America, but they consider those figures to be like outside of America. They don't consider that to be part of American history. So they separate, like the movement for Black liberation from America itself. And that's a very big mistake, because that movement is an imminent development of the contradictions, the objective contradictions of the American project, of the development of capitalism in the U.S. But by rejecting the whole, they express the similar forms of thinking, the similar worldview that say the Social Democrats express when they speak about China, and they reject China, or they reject the Soviet Union, which is that they take a part of something, of a process, and they make it out to be the whole, and they reject the contradictions that exist within that thing. They reject the fact that social totality exists in a constant dynamic process of development, with all of its parts in a constant interconnection to one another, with change, things transforming and taking qualitative leaps in various areas. And they reject, in essence, a dialectical understanding of these things. And many people who are very good in some areas, you see them in this area, and they're expressing the same mistakes that sometimes they criticize very well in these other areas. And that's the importance, I think, of talking about it as a worldview. And you brought up, the American Civil War, which I think it's fair to consider America's second Revolutionary War. That's one of the ways that Du Bois talked about it. But one of the saddest things is the forgetting of Du Bois, and this is something that I bring up in the section where I'm describing how the U.S. left, the U.S. communists relate to their history, which is that one of the most impressive usage, or one of the most impressive depictions of how the bourgeoisie, its historians, and its ideologues in general could make a people forget its history is the fact that today the US left doesn't celebrate the Reconstruction South as the first dictatorship of labor to take root in the modern era. You have, after the end of the Civil War, and sometimes while the war was still being fought, in the US South, in the former slave states, you have a dictatorship of labor, a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's how W.E.B. Du Bois, the person who has done the most important scholarship on Reconstruction, describes it. And at that time, he very much understood what a dictatorship of labor was. He had been to Russia, and he had, said in various places that, if this is Bolshevism, I consider myself a Bolshevik. But he reinterpreted the class struggle dynamics that took place in the Civil War, and he saw that the reason why it was won was because it was a general strike. So in the same way that we would, if workers were to rise up in a general strike, go to the other side, fight with the other side, defeat an army in a war, and then a new mode of production arises, we call that a dictatorship of labor. We call that a revolution. And that's what the black proletariat, which is a tremendously important category. It's, the first chapter that Du Bois has in the book. At that time, the labor movement in the US was considered to be just the wage workers in the South. They considered them, just slaves. They didn't see the Southern slave worker as a worker. And therefore, the labor movement never really thought to tie itself into the movement for the emancipation of the black slaves. And that was, Du Bois explains, one of the biggest mistakes, because had they would have become an irresistible force. What occurred in various small places of the U.S. South could have taken root in the whole country. But you have a case where the war starts and slaves start fleeing north. And when they do that, and they realize that, oh wow, the people that are getting there are emancipated, they're not like getting sent back. What happens is that, hundreds of thousands and then millions of them flee the South, removing the South of its productive base, that's where its labor was coming from, and giving the North spies, people who knew the land in the South, soldiers and workers. And that's why the war was won, right? It's funny, I remember being in like high school history class or something, or undergrad history class, and it's always a story where, the South starts winning, and then out of nowhere, the resources run low, and then the South starts losing, the North starts winning. It's like, yeah, I wonder why. It was because there was a fucking general strike, and the black proletariat went north and saved the war. But in the process of doing so, it wins emancipation. It develops the Friedmans Bureau, and the Friedmans Bureau was the institution which in the South guaranteed that the interests of the black proletariat, and also in many places the white southern, the poor southern white, was also the most important one in terms of consideration. And this was defended militarily by the federal government. There's no other way to refer to that than as a dictatorship of. So that goes on for like almost a decade in the U.S. South. It starts before the French, the Paris Commune in France, and it lasts way longer than the 72 days of the Paris Commune. But no one fucking talks about it. Not in the world communist movement, not in the U.S. communist movement. No one fucking talks about it. And I had the opportunity recently to speak for the anniversary of the Paris Commune with the IMG, an event that we co-sponsored. Midwestern Marx co-sponsored it with the International Manifesto Group. I got to give a short speech on the Paris Commune, and I mentioned it at the end. We have our own commune, and we don't know about it. And part of us not knowing about it is not just the good job that the bourgeoisie and its ideologues have done in terms of propaganda and the erasure of our history, but also the left that has allowed itself to have its history taken from it. Because it's a whole different way of approaching your people when you say, look, we have this very progressive history. We had not only the first socialist experiments in the 19th century in terms of utopian socialism, but we have the first dictatorship of the proletariat. So socialism is it's in our blood and veins. It's the best things that we have in the history of our country. The moments in the history of our country where the bourgeois ideals that are proclaimed in 1776 are to the largest extent actualized was thanks to socialist struggles and thanks to the struggles of the proletariat. And we don't talk about this. So this is again the purity fetish and how it takes form in the analysis of American communists' national past. And it's another way of speaking about what Dimitrov called national nihilism.
For sure. Thank you, Lillian, for the becoming a new YouTube member. We recently hit 20 of those. So shout out to all of you. That's interesting. We only ever hear about the failure of Reconstruction, right? They never talk about, what Reconstruction was, how that was essentially a dictatorship of labor. It's always about the sort of bourgeois counter-revolution that followed and how, the ideals of Reconstruction were never realized. And then, we'd say that nobody ever talks about nobody ever talks about that, like the Paris Commune, which is true. But, like you said, that should be our Paris Commune. I mean, Marx was in Europe, so he wrote about the Paris Commune in France, right? We're in America. That's our history. And this is, kind of the hope in rejecting this sort of historical nihilism, is that this is our history. This is a history that people already have a grasp on, right? A history that people are proud of in many ways. And we're not teaching the class dynamics of it. And we're not teaching, and in that there's all sorts of failures. It's nihilistic. People think that there can't be a dictatorship of labor ever. There's strategy to be realized in reviewing our history and understanding that what we need to do is unify labor, move away from racism, move away from identity politics, bring together the proletariat of all colors, races, ethnicities, religions, whatever else, and unify based on our position in relation to the means of production. So there's so much that's lost by allowing that history to go, or being nihilistic about it and talking about it as all bad. And yeah, and that's why your book is so important too.
Right. It's important to remember that history isn't just in the past. History shapes how we approach the future, how we engage in revolutionary praxis. So, this task of recapturing our progressive history, which is really a task of, you know, capturing truth, right? That's why I consider myself a philosopher. I am a philosopher. It's not what I am a philosopher. And philosophy is, but the love of truth, the search for knowledge, the search for truth. So I it's more than just how we think about the past. It's how us thinking about the past helps us grapple with truth and move forward in a manner which can actually help us build a revolutionary movement. So, you know, I'm not just saying it because it's my book, but I do consider that there's this serious crisis on the left where decade after decade after decade, objective revolutionary conditions arise and nothing fundamentally changes.
They're squandered every time.
Every single time. And every single time, if you study these movements carefully, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, the movement against the war in Iraq, and the Bernie Sanders movement, whether it's the Black Lives Matter protests, we had almost 35 million people in the streets. What's missing is organization, leadership, ideological clarity about what's going on, how do we move forward, what are the forces that exist now, what are the historical conditions which allow them to exist now in the way in which they do. And I think that this book can help us in overcoming the ideological flaws that stand as fetters, as obstacles for this revolutionary movement, and which have led us continuously to fail while we have the best tools to succeed. We have today, we're not living in 1870s US. We're not even living in 1960s US. We're living in 2023. You know, the conditions that exist within our racially diverse working class are much different than what they were 50 years ago. Today, the conditions for a united working class struggle are as fertile as ever. And at the same time, the conditions for the decline of the American empire are, you know, we're seeing them right now. You know, the ruling class can't continue to rule in the old way, right? So we have everything there, and all that's missing is for us to have, you know, a transformation of outlook, to have the potential to have clarity about our current situation, and therefore the ability to move forward in a way that actually works.